Hello, in this video, we are going to look at a first CBT session with a young woman called Lucy who has gone to see a clinical psychologist, Judith Johnson, after visiting her GP. We're going to not critique the video in terms of its therapeutic effectiveness or the therapeutic principles at play. What we're interested in is the nonverbal behavior expressed by the client. In particular, in this video, we're going to pay attention to a broad range of nonverbal cues. We're going to look at what some of the evidence base is behind each one, and we're going to just explore how in certain times and places, integrating nonverbal behavior analysis into this session could have a positive impact. In particular, we're looking for any nonverbal cue that is an indicator of changing levels of arousal, so activation, cognition, how hard they're working cognitively, or emotional processing, the flow of emotion, also referred to as nonverbal ACEs. Now, in credibility assessments or deception detection contexts, we might be looking for inconsistencies with either the story they're telling us, their normal behavior, or the circumstances that they're in. Whereas in this video, we're looking for any nonverbal cue that could be used to therapeutic advantage and integrated into the session to help the client shift their attention from their narrative, their story of events, onto their physiology and their perceptions and their judgments, and to help them make real self-discovery and meaningful change. Let's dive in. A little bit of context here. So Lucy has been experiencing low mood and symptoms of depression, and she's described these to a GP. She's been referred to psychological therapy, and here we are in her first session. Let's have a look.
Hi, Lucy.
So we can take a brief overview at the sort of original setup, and we can see that we've got a nice mirroring going on of posture and or body language here, where we've got the therapist in a comfortable, upright and cross-legged position, and Lucy is adopting a somewhat similar position. Now, there may be many reasons for this, one of which may be it could just be both of their preferences in terms of comfort. It could be in certain situations where the therapist might have a more authoritarian role or more superior role in the eyes of the client. And so the client therefore mimics the nonverbal behavior they observe through the therapist. So there are many possible reasons for it, but it's just something to observe nice and early on.
Nice to meet you.
Hi.
We start off with a smile from our client here. We can see in terms of its profile, it has a sharp onset and offset. So we have action unit 12 or AU12, where the corners of the lips are pulled towards the ears. But we saw very little activation in AU6, the cheek raiser, which tends to create the crow's feet wrinkles. And AU6 and AU12 combined are more typically associated with a genuine expression of a happiness or smile. Now, we are in the first few moments of a therapy session, so we would expect here for there to be polite social signals rather than genuine happiness. So we've got a perfectly normal expression here. We also want to consider the idea of impression management. So Lucy is just meeting the therapist for the first time and therefore wants to portray a friendly demeanor and attitude, and therefore a social smile is entirely appropriate.
So I understand that you were referred here by your GP because you've been feeling quite down recently.
Yeah, I thought I should.
And within the first few seconds of addressing the context of why we're here, we see a very subtle downward tilt of the head. We see an aversion of the gaze. Now, there are many different reasons for why someone may tilt and avert their gaze. From an emotional perspective, if we are in a social setting where we perceive the environment or the information that we're discussing or the information we're sharing it with is in somehow or some way distressing or threatening, we can sometimes avert our gaze in order to reduce the level of visual stimulus that we perceive to then help us to think or to cope in the moment. What we also see in terms of this presentation, if someone is experiencing a degree of guilt or a degree of shame, one of the ways that the research evidences that we can compensate for this is this averted gaze position. From an emotional memory image theory perspective, if we have an active emotional memory image, we may also see that the eyes are averted from that position in order to, again, cope with that stimulus. Now, I wouldn't suggest we would share any of this at this stage, but it's an interesting observation in the first few seconds.
I've been feeling quite bad for quite a while, so I thought.
And even just a few seconds later, we start to see some activity in the shoulder. So we can observe a single-sided shoulder shrug or elevation. This typically is a fragment of a larger gesture along the lines of, I don't have any confidence in this, or I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So it indicates a lack of certainty. Now, this may simply be a postural adjustment. It may be part of her normal communicative behavior, but it's also worth considering that it may be a context where she's lacking a little bit of confidence. And given the situation that she's in, so the context that she's in, that would also be entirely appropriate. And it's something that we can observe as we go through.
Maybe it's time to see someone about it because I don't want to feel like this anymore.
Okay.
And we can see that slightly larger elevation of the left side there on that particular example. And that is very much aligned with her verbal narrative.
Okay, so from your notes, I saw that you saw the GP about 3 months ago.
Yeah.
So how long have you been feeling down altogether?
Quite a few months before that as well, actually, but it's gotten pretty bad these past few months. So that's
interesting element here we can see in terms of her gestures, so in particular the movement of the head. So as she refers to her past, we also see a flick of the head to her left side. There is some research to indicate that in Western cultures, at least, we may store and process past-based information on our left-hand side, where more future-orientated information is stored more on our right side. The research on that is tenuous, but it is something that we will commonly see. We can come back to this nonverbal cue later to observe if, when she refers to past events, she again makes the flick to that side.
kind of why I came.
Okay, so has it got worse since you saw your GP?
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
down?
As she is describing why she came, we notice a slightly increase in the breath. We notice a little bit of a swallow, and we can see that there's just a little bit of glassiness developing in her eyes here. So potentially indicative of a little bit of emotion coming up, which of course is if she's been describing some difficult few months in this case, that would also be perfectly congruent with the situation. But it might be worth bringing up at some point. If this young lady is struggling maybe to connect with certain feelings, just by highlighting to her, well, did you notice what happened as you thought about that? That then allows her to start to scan her body to think about what's going on in her system so she stays really grounded with the words that she's saying and the impact that they have on her.
Okay, sad.
Yeah.
And you feel like you haven't got any motivation. But are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine, sorry.
Once again, we can see that emotion just starting to build in the face as that glassy eye quality returns. We have another elevation of that left shoulder, and we've got a somewhat nervous piece of laughter here to just hopefully diffuse the situation. Now, an interesting element here is the therapist decided to almost highlight that she was detecting something, but she didn't necessarily specify what she observed that led her to ask that question. So in these cases, sometimes it's interesting to just simply ask the question, what are you noticing at the moment? And allow the client to bring that into the session. And then sometimes it's a different way of shining a light on it.
Okay, and you haven't got any motivation. It sounds like you're putting quite a lot of pressure on yourself to try and feel a bit better.
Yeah, it's kind of hard as well because there's not really anyone to talk about some.
We're starting to see somewhat of a theme in this session. So, as she's describing certain problems, we are getting more of a double-sided shoulder shrug there. So, this seems to be quite characteristic of her in this context. We also see another tilting of the head and a lowering the gaze. So, we're starting to develop a little bit of a pattern for her in this particular context.
I just kind of stay on my own, I don't like to think about it, but I just know.
Okay. So
we can also observe here that we're seeing the ongoing movements that we've discussed so far. In that clip just a few moments ago, we see the eyes move up and fixate on a central point here. Now, emotional memory image theory would suggest she may be accessing mental images that are maybe outside of her awareness. So it'll be interesting to observe as we go through if that fixation point sort of centrally and above the eye line continues and how she responds when she accesses that point.
You say you've been going back in time a little bit. I suppose I'm just wondering when did all of this start? You said it's been going on for quite a few months.
Yeah. I guess it kind of started.
And as she's almost directing her attention inwards at this point, we can see a very tiny horizontal flicker in the movement of the eyes, which is suggestive of a degree of auditory dialogue. So maybe she's having a little bit of a chat with herself to try and figure out when it's occurring.
When I was revising for my exams, I guess I put a lot of stress on myself, I think.
And as we broach, or as the client broaches the topic of stress, we then see what's known as a manipulator, so where one body part touches another. These are sometimes often referred to as adapters, and there are a vast array of research on how these function and why these function. Some research suggests that when we experience any degree of interpersonal stress, the frequency of our self-touch increases. There is also other research that kind of looks at it from the other lens and suggests that when we're in a relaxed and comfortable state, we can also do these sort of adapter type positions as well. So there's a broad range of reasons why we might do that. In this particular case, we notice the adapter occurring almost instantaneously after the context of stress is raised. And so we might not choose to bring this to our attention. We might not bring it into the conversation at all. But it's interesting to note, and we might come back to it later if it again becomes a common theme.
I've always wanted to do well for me and I guess for my parents. So the stress of exams, and it was also kind of hard.
A much more obvious downward tilt of the head here, and again an aversion of the gaze. So consistent with her behavior as we see it so far. And it would be interesting in this particular moment, as it was a more prominent movement, if we were to ask, so get permission, if we could pause there for a moment and then just ask her, when she was just doing that thought, what did she notice? And then ask her what's happening in her body and just inquire with her as to what that could mean.
Because my parents were going through a bit of a troubled time then. So.
Okay, so this would be like that.
We can start to see a little bit of emotion starting to build in the face again. We're starting to see that glassy eye quality. So we'll just pay attention to how this progresses.
Last March, last April?
Yeah, I think so.
Around that time, so about 6 months-ish.
Yeah.
And
it was hard as well.
And just in those last few moments there, again, we see the emotion rise in the face, and we also see somewhat of a laboured swallow. Now, there are many different reasons why we may observe a swallow. Sometimes it'll be purely coincidental and the individual just needed to swallow. What we can notice is when the swallow becomes a little bit more laboured. So in that case, it looked as though it may have been a little bit more laboured. Now, from a physiological perspective, the research shows us that when our system is perceiving some kind of threat, so real or imagined, the sympathetic nervous system activates, so our fight and flight system engages, and therefore all of the bodily processes that are involved with parasympathetic activation, in particular digestion, are somewhat dialed down. as the digestive system obviously starts does its main work in the belly and the abdomen, but it actually starts up in the salivary ducts in the mouth. And so when the digestive system is dialed down, that can lead to dryness in the mouth. It can lead to dryness in the throat, so a more labored swallow. And so a possible occurrence here is that we've moved into an emotionally challenging context. Her sympathetic nervous system has somewhat activated, and we're now starting to observe the visible markers of an increase in arousal.
Because I wasn't doing well at uni, I guess I just felt a bit guilty. I know it sounds silly, but I felt...
And we've got a lovely pinpoint moment here where, again, she's going back to that central fixation. So there's no conscious awareness here of what she's viewing, or not that she's sharing anyway. And she's visiting that point a couple of times. So this would suggest that there is some mental imagery running in this particular moment.
Like, maybe if I could do better, then they would get better, but it just wasn't really happening.
Okay, so it sounds like you were trying to work hard and... Okay.
Once again, we observe a laboured swallow there, and we notice from a vocalics perspective, volume and tone just starts to tail off a little bit. There is lots of interesting studies that show how, when our emotional state varies, that this has an impact on our vocal apparatus. So, for example, when our nervous system is heightened, that leads to an increase in tension in the vocal cords, which can often manifest as an increase in pitch. But what we can also observe is a decrease in volume when we're maybe trying to distance ourselves from a particular topic because it might be emotionally uncomfortable.
So after the summer, after the exam period, and how did that exam period go for you in the end?
Not very well.
And in this moment, I think it would be, again, a really interesting point to maybe pause the session for a moment. So before going on to any future questions, and just ask Lucy, what is she noticing? What just happened? So verbally, she's giving us the information that it didn't go very well. So relatively gentle language here. But from a non-verbal perspective, it's suggesting that not going very well actually had quite a big impact on her. So it would be really worth pausing here, shining a light on that, bringing that into her attention in a nice, gentle, curious way, and then just exploring what's going on for her.
I'm just wondering if you have very high standards for yourself.
Probably, maybe more than other people. My parents have always kind of taught me, not in a loving way, I guess, but...
We've got another one of her dancing shoulder moments here. So we're getting lots of non-verbal activity here. From a linguistic point of view, we can notice that she begins to generalize. So we're starting to hear words like always, which is in keeping with kind of the language choices that she was using before. And as she's talking about this particular context, we'll just notice what else happens in her non-verbal behavior.
That you should do your best, but also get the best. And I agree with that. I think that's the right thing to do.
From this position, we can see that as she verbally states, I agree with that, we also get just a very subtle shaking of the head. Now, in some contexts, we might consider this a little bit of an incongruence. So the statement is affirmative, but we're actually seeing somewhat of a opposite response in terms of her non-verbal behavior. So if we were in a credibility analysis context or a deception detection context, these are sometimes referred to as emblematic slips, or it's a form of non-verbal leakage where we're maybe expressing information that maybe we're for some reason withholding, whether that's privacy or politeness or whatever that might be. And again, we may not raise it and identify it or name it in this moment, but it might also be worth exploring if it's something that she genuinely agrees with, or if it's something that she's learned, or just exploring the implications of that.
I think, but when I don't do that, I don't know, it annoys me a lot, and I worry that it annoys them.
What's the situation?
So in that last piece there, as he says, I worry that it annoys them. Again, we get a nice big intake of breath. So we've got an increase in arousal. So we've got an increase in activation here, somewhat of a bracing breath. We could see a little bit more fullness in the face where the emotion was there, a little bit of a glassiness in the eye. So again, it might be worth pausing here when she says, I worry it concerns them, to then explore what's happening for her, what does she notice in that moment, and where that might come from. That may then take us to actually an original moment where these learnings occurred, and applying our interventions there might then allow that to ripple through time.
With your parents at the moment?
I think it doesn't sound good. I don't really talk to them a lot, but I don't think they're going through a very good thing. I don't like to.
We can see once more consistent behaviour in terms of that tilting. We're noticing a little bit of a change in her volume again. And if we just carry on and see how this moves forwards.
Talk to them about it because it just makes me feel worse.
Okay.
Now, that gesturing is interesting. So we've got that bilateral symmetrical gesture here, not in terms of it meaning anything in particular or being of significance, but generally throughout these clips, we're not observing too many gestures. So that particular moment is somewhat different to the others. It's just worth noticing and paying attention to.
But I don't think it's getting any better.
And once more, we've got that adapter, so self-touching. Based on the context here, I think it would be reasonable to conclude that it's likely she's experiencing some unpleasant emotions, whatever they might be. Could be an opportunity to help her name those emotions, so to share what's happening in her body in this moment in time. But we can at least see that there's some level of discomfort here.
Are you home over the summer?
For a little bit, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how is that?
Not very fun.
So we've got, again, an uplift of emotion into the face, a little bit more fuller in the face, eyes becoming glassy once more. Again, we're seeing lots of the same patterns here, but it's worth bringing them up each time so we can just get a little bit more accurate at seeing them. We've got an interesting element of there's clearly some background distress here, and we're going into a nervous or an uncomfortable smile. So we're seeing a somewhat contradictory expression, but it's one that many of us use. So the work of Paul Ekman showed that there are many, many different types of smiles, over 20, I believe, in fact. And so one of the more common ones is that in those situations where we feel uncomfortable, one of the ways that we can compensate or cope for that is by actually bringing smiles or even a little bit of nervous laughter into the situation.
Yeah, it was quite tense all the time. It stressed me out more than relaxed me over the summer, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It might be worth pausing here as well. So she's talking about a degree of being stressed out. So although we can't see sort of much of her lower body here, it'd be really interesting to see what's happening in that lower body. So is there any increase in tension? Is there any change in her sort of breathing mechanics? So are we seeing less diaphragmatical breathing? And also just noticing what our hands are doing. Are we getting any other types of adapters? Are we seeing any increase in tension in the hands or the knuckles? These are, again, interesting to highlight and interesting to bring to the client's attention and just allow them to take that with them.
Okay, so it sounds like those are some quite negative thoughts to have. You're kind of saying, it feels like it's pointless, it's more effort than it's worth, and I don't deserve to be here. I mean, when you have those thoughts, how do you feel?
Very.
So we've got a lovely fixation point here as well. So here the therapist has now moved into the area of feelings, but interestingly, we're not talking about how she feels in the moment. We're not talking about how she feels now. We're more generalized asking how does she feel in those types of moments. So we can see a lovely eye fixation here. So we'll just follow this through.
Unworthy probably would be the best way to put it. Kind of, I don't know, lower than normal. Because then it makes me think about all the things that I should have been doing better.
Once again, we've got that gesture over to that left side when she talks about the things that she should have been doing better. So we've got past tense in terms of language, a gestural nod over to that side, just giving us a little bit more confidence that Lucy stores past-orientated information on her left in terms of her visual timeline, which would suggest that it's more future-based on the right.
Okay, so what you described, what kind of emotions do you feel? Happier? Do you feel sad? What kind of emotions are you feeling when you have those thoughts?
Sad, not happiness. Okay. No, sad. A bit of kind of anger and frustration as well.
Okay. Notice when you
We've got a lovely spike of activity here. So once again, we've got a tilt and the aversion of the gaze. We've got a laboured swallow there, and this is following the stimuli of talking about being a little bit angry and a little bit frustrated. So talking about our many different reasons for this particular response. If this individual, based on her upbringing, her sort of social networks and her family rules, if you like, if being frustrated and angry is something that's not approved of, we can have some self-judgment here that then gets expressed in terms of a non-verbal behaviour.
Kind of telling me this, and I know this is quite a heavy topic, but you're kind of laughing, and I suppose I wonder a little bit, are you a bit, how do you feel about having these emotions?
We've got a lovely moment here where the therapist brings that almost contradictory response into the light. We actually get a genuine smile there, so we get much more animation in the face. We get another one of those adapters, so highlighting that there's just activity going on, but we have a moment of levity there. She brings that nonverbal cue into the light and it brings it to the client's attention.
Talking about these emotions.
I guess embarrassed. I've never yet to talk about it, so it's quite uncomfortable to be in this situation.
Again, lovely non-verbal behaviour changes here. So we're seeing more of a right-sided shoulder elevation here. Once more with the tilting and the gaze, we've got that manipulator coming in, or the adapter. And so we've got a little cluster of signals here that's suggesting maybe the levels of emotion have increased somewhat. Sharing those with the client and just say, I just noticed there's quite a bit of movement there in your body. What are you noticing here? And helping her to reflect. This increases her ability to mindfully observe her own nonverbal behavior. This allows her to connect to her internal bodily signals in a lighter, curious way, so allowing her to explore those signals rather than name them in any particular way. And because we've got a little bit of a cluster here, from a behavior analysis point of view, we can have more confidence that maybe that increase in activation is there. But from a therapeutic perspective, any one of those signals can be used to shine a light and to bring them into the moment.
Okay, well, you're doing a great job, because I know that this can be difficult. So you start having these thoughts, these emotions, and your body, I guess it sounds like those thoughts are quite draining, so they're draining your energy. What then happens? What do you do next?
I kind of focus on the negative thoughts when I probably should not think about them, but I focus on them and then I don't really want to do anything.
Listening to her language here, she's talking about negative thoughts, and we're not necessarily getting any insight into if she's aware that she might be generating negative pictures. So often we might be able to bring into our awareness the way that we're talking to ourselves, and we might be able to almost try and challenge that or to rationalize what we're saying to ourselves. But if we're also generating those negative, scary mental images, then trying to wrestle with that narrative change inside our head could be really difficult and sometimes not very effective.
Can I stay in bed or?
So you think even more about those kind of worries that you have. So you do a bit of dwelling and you stay in bed.
And bless her, we can see her in this position. So again, we've got that emotion coming up. We've got these consistent non-verbal cues. So we've got a really good idea about how her non-verbal behavior is expressed in this session. It would be really interesting to find out how aware she is of her non-verbal behavior. And therefore, if we were to be bringing these just little moments into her awareness, just noticing what happens as she connects to this more. And there we have it, a broad range of cues and some really fascinating nonverbal behavior that, if approached with curiosity and genuine interest, we can bring these into the light, help the client explore their own physiology, and make meanings that help them to move forwards. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the nonverbal cues displayed in this session. Please pop them in the comments below, and I'll see you soon. Bye.